Hey, what's up guys? My name is Michael Westbrook. As always, thank you for checking out this video. Today we're going to be talking about 5 common mistakes that guitarists make when they're recording. Now, I want to say at the beginning of this video that I don't have it all figured out. And most of these have come from my own experiences and things that I've had to figure out and work on, and in some cases are still working on. I also want to encourage you with some of these ideas to really dig into them. I'm going to be sharing some of my experiences with them and how these things played out, but it can be easy to just write off some of these when you initially hear them. You're like, oh yeah, I've heard that before, I get it, I'm going to skip ahead. But I myself find that when I really dug into some of these concepts, when I really started applying them and really started working on them and trying to identify what that actually means in the context of recording myself and doing all of that, that I really started to understand it more. And something that I might have initially just kind of passed off as like, oh yeah, I get that, I know that, really took on a lot more meaning as I explored it more. Before we get into all that, do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, and also check out some of the links in the description below. There's links to presets and Kemper profiles, speaker IRs, also a link to my new course on creating and layering guitar parts. All of those are great resources as well as ways to support the channel. All right, let's get into it. One big mistake that I see guitarists make when it comes to recording is worrying about gear too much. I definitely have been guilty of this and have to keep myself in check about it. But the thing is gear has gotten so good these days, especially when it comes to recording gear and recording interfaces, that there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get great sounds from lowering gear. Now, I think the trick here is to really dig in with the gear that you have. Really spend a lot of time exploring what it can do, figure out what it can't do, and maybe the shortcomings, and work around it. A lot of times, it's not necessarily the gear's fault, but maybe the way you're recording, or the part, or something else about what you're trying to accomplish. A lot of times, it's not the gear, it's just a matter of finding the right technique to maximize what you already have. Now, one of my favorite examples with this has to do with a song that I recorded several years back. Me and my wife have a band called the Hot Hearts, and we were asked to do a song for a benefit project that was being released. We had a deadline and I completely forgot about it. And we got an email on the day of the deadline and it said, hey, are you guys going to submit for this? It was all Christmas songs. And I said, oh man, I totally forgot. Let's record this really quick. And we were at our apartment at the time, and all I had was a DigiDesign 002 rack mounted gear, rack mount piece of gear that has built-in preamps, and I think I had a Sennheiser 609, and we did the song acoustic and vocal. And so I recorded everything with this, guitar amp mic. And the acoustic, I had to crank the preamps. They were super noisy, and we recorded the vocal with the same mic. The acoustic guitar was so noisy that I just had to soak it in reverb just to cover up some of the noise. And I recorded it, mixed it, sent it out all in the same day, and that song I think now has over 650,000 plays on Spotify. And if I had just said, oh, my gear isn't good enough, I can't do this, then we wouldn't have been able to release that song and it wouldn't have happened. But it just goes to show you that the gear doesn't maybe matter as much as we think it does. Obviously, we want it to sound as good as possible, and we want to have great gear that we can rely on for great sounds, but in the end, if you're focusing more on gear than you are recording, then you might want to rethink things. The second big mistake I see guitarists make when they're recording is having too much noise in their signal. Now, I like to think about this in 3 different places. We get noise from our guitars, we can get noise from our pedal boards, and noise from our amps. Now, when it comes to guitars, sometimes there's only so much we can do about this. Assuming that the guitar is, as it should be, everything's shielded and properly grounded, even single coil guitars can give us a slight noise depending on what's around us. Here in my home studio, I definitely get noise on my single coil guitars and certain days even from my humbucker guitars. And there's only so much I can do about that. But some things I do to alleviate that are turn in a certain direction. Sometimes if I'm turned in a certain way, it will minimize the noise. There are also dimmers in my house in certain places, and I can go and turn those off. Sometimes that helps. Some days are just noisier than others, and it's kind of a drag, but it is what it is. The second place that we can have noise comes from our pedal boards. Now, assuming everything is powered properly and all of that, sometimes it might just mean that we take pedals out of the chain that we aren't using for a certain sound. We want to get that noise floor as low as possible so that it doesn't become a problem later on. The next place is with our amps. Sometimes we might have a preamp tube that's noisy, or there's just something about the amp that's inherently noisy. And that's not all bad. Amps make noise, guitars make noise. That's all part of it. But again, we want to minimize it so as we stack guitars and as we continue to record and go through that process, it doesn't all become a problem. Because if every guitar has a little bit of noise in it, by the end, if we have 4 or 5 guitars, then that noise is even louder. Especially as we move into a mixing process or a mastering process and we start to compress guitars or we start to EQ, that can accentuate noise even more. And so that makes it even more important that we try to minimize that as much as possible. Another big mistake that I see guitarists make when they're recording is using too many effects. Now, whether that's effects from your pedal board or effects within your DAW, compression, EQ, whatever the case, a lot of times it's easy to throw on all these effects to try to fix a problem or get a better sound, and we end up just making it sound worse than what it sounded like at the beginning. Early on, I definitely was guilty of this, where I had a session and everything had, multiple plugins and tons of plugins. And I remember at one time, hearing, oh, you're using too many plugins. And I was like, I don't know, I'm going to take them all off and we'll see. And I took all the plugins off and I was like, oh, wow, that actually does sound better in a lot of ways. Sometimes we don't need as many plugins or effects as we think we do. Sometimes as far as our guitar tone goes, it maybe means we need to use a little less overdrive or a little less delay, a little less reverb. Because when we start stacking all of these tracks on top of each other, sometimes it can just be too much and it can create clutter, it can create muddiness, and in the end doesn't make it sound as good as it could if we used less effects and did less to the actual sound. Now, again, this is something that you have to experiment with. You have to learn about it. You have to, try different things. It's trial and error, because sometimes there are going to be times when you really want to heavily EQ something, or you do want to use a ton of reverb on a certain type of sound. But as you do it more, as you experiment with it, you kind of will get a feel and get a taste for when the right time for that is and when maybe you should dial things back. Another big mistake I see when recording guitars is not creating parts that complement each other. Now, whether that's the note choice or the type of part we're playing or even tonally, if we don't create parts that work together and work to contribute to the whole, then things can get really cluttered, they can get really muddy. They just overall are not going to be as good as they can be. When we create parts that work together and contribute to the whole, that have their own unique space, it's going to allow the song to really have great impact. I talk a lot about this in my new course. The big idea with that is just creating parts that have their own space and really work together. I've heard it said that the key to a great mix is a great arrangement. So when we think about our parts, when we write and record parts that all work together, it's going to make sure that the final product is as good as it can be. Now, this last mistake is something that I am continually working on, and honestly has been probably one of the toughest things for me to get used to when recording. I love dark guitar tones, but they don't always work great in the context of a mix. I find myself having to carve out a lot of low mids or a lot of lows in guitars and brighten them up. So as I've recorded more, I've started recording my guitars a little brighter. Now, this isn't going to be the case for everyone, but I found when I think about the context of the whole, similar to our last point, that I don't need as much of that warmth or as much of that low end in my guitars. I think the tendency for beginner guitarists is that they want their guitars to sound massive. They have the full range of the spectrum, like the lowest of lows and the highest of highs. But a lot of times we need to limit where it sits EQ-wise so that it leaves space for other things. Now, this can be tricky because we're not only dealing with the EQ of the sound and how that relates to everything else in a mix, but we're also dealing with volume and perceived volume. Sometimes I find that I can record a brighter guitar and turn it down and it doesn't sound as bright as it maybe initially does. Or maybe I have a darker guitar sound and I can bring it up louder in the mix and it doesn't seem harsh and seems nice and full. It's all kind of this experimentation of figuring out how much is bright enough, how much is too bright, how much warmth is good, and how much is muddy. It's kind of a never-ending journey, it seems like. But for me, thinking about the EQ and how that pertains to everything else going on has been a big learning process, and I've definitely seen a lot of improvement by being conscious of that and being conscious of how my guitars are sitting EQ-wise in the context of the whole. That's going to do it for this one. Hopefully this video was helpful and gives you some good things to think about as you're recording. If you're not recording, I definitely encourage you to record yourself as much as possible. I know for me, doing these videos and constantly making demos and recording my own playing, I have improved so much. It kind of gives me a good way to hear myself back and hear myself within the context. And I'm just getting in reps. I'm doing it more and having to create parts and get different tones. And all of that has helped me improve, not only playing wise, but being able to do things more quickly, being able to come up with parts more quickly and come up with different types of tones more easily. I've seen that come out in my playing on live gigs as well as studio sessions. So it's kind of my belief that recording yourself is one of the best ways to improve your playing and to learn more about guitar and how that all works. So if you're not doing it, I definitely encourage you to find some way to record yourself. All right, that's going to do it. Until next time, I'll see you out there.